Great. Let's go ahead and start. It's right on the starting hour, starting time, but I'm going to start with prayers as usual, and then we'll do a short meditation. And then I want to kind of check in with people and see how the last week went, as well as see if there were any questions from what we covered last week. So let's go ahead and begin with the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. And I think, again, going forward for the rest of the classes, maybe the last one will do something different, but let's go ahead and recite this just once rather than 3 times, and then we'll go on to do the other prayers. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And we'll do the short mandala offering, again, visualizing the entire phenomenal world transformed into a beautiful kind of Buddha paradise that's indicative of the fully enlightened state that ourselves and all beings can attain. And we're making this vast pure offering so that we can receive the blessings of the gurus, the Buddhas, so we can accomplish all of what we're learning, realize all of this in our own minds, and actualize the path to enlightenment completely. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then refuge in bodhicitta, as usual, first time in English, and then twice more in Tibetan, bringing these 2 thoughts to mind. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chenyen gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar sho. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Panchir Sangye Drupar Sho. Let's do a short meditation then. Again, just give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit. You can use the breath as a meditation object for the first few minutes. And whenever you see the mind wandering away from the breath, just guide the mind gently back to the breath and then use whatever technique you prefer to use with the breath. And then I'll come in just a few minutes. We'll do a short reflection on these 2 minds of self-cherishing and self-grasping, just briefly, to incorporate that into setting our motivation for tonight. So I'll ring the bowl here to begin the meditation. So now let's set our motivation by first recalling these twin demons, the minds of self-centeredness, self-cherishing, as well as the mind of self-grasping. And we're setting our motivation. We ideally want to be thinking about overcoming both of these. But the first one, mind of self-cherishing, is the mind that keeps us from developing conventional bodhicitta, which is the motivation that we need to bring to these teachings. So again, we need to see how that mind operates, sometimes in a very subtle way, sometimes actually very coarse. This tendency that we have to focus on our own welfare to the exclusion of others. Now it becomes all about us, our needs, oftentimes even abusing or using others in terms of trying to get what we want and what we need for our happiness, for our well-being. And we generate the mind of bodhicitta, conventional mind. It's the antidote to this. It's the mind that cherishes others, that thinks about them first, that through the force of love and compassion for all beings, is making a commitment to fully awaken for their sake, to become a Buddha so we can lead every single sentient being out of samsara, out of the unenlightened state, to the state of complete enlightenment. So it's a mind of deep concern for other beings. And the antithesis, the opposite of the mind of self-centeredness, self-cherishing. But the other demon, the mind of self-grasping, is the deeper error that we are all making in terms of how things exist, but primarily how the I exists, the sense of self that we have in regard to our own personhood that exaggerates the way that this being exists, gives it a status of independence, inherent existence, intrinsic existence, and so on. This mind of self-grasping is the root of all of our problems. It's what keeps us bound in samsara. It's what keeps us continuing to experience suffering, to not attain true happiness. And it's keeping us from becoming fully enlightened. So when we generate this mind of conventional bodhicitta, we can, in a way, unite it with the sense of ultimate bodhicitta, to hold the view that while we are making this determination to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings, we ourselves do not exist inherently. Other beings who we are becoming enlightened for do not exist from their own side. Nothing exists in that way. So we bring a wisdom aspect to our generation of the motivation of bodhicitta as well. In this way, we kind of chip away each time when we hold thoughts that are contrary to these two demons. We generate some strength of mind that will eventually overcome them. So hold that mind of bodhicitta that is also informed by the wisdom of emptiness. So in this way, we're creating the causes to overcome both of these demons. I said I did want to check in with people just to see how the last week was. I know that was kind of a tall order to ask you to kind of be attentive to your minds and see when self-cherishing is arising, when self-grasping is arising, just to begin to kind of see how they're operating in your life. Not that you're going to be perfect in having that mindful awareness of them, but I'm curious if there were any observations that anyone had that they would like to share before we begin the class, or anything else from last week that you feel you need some clarification on. Anyone? Nanda, please.
So it's not really about the content of what you're talking about. I have to report that I'm experiencing severe technical difficulties I have an old iPad, and I may disappear just like a poof for no apparent reason. So I've got my Zoom on my phone, and I'll balance everything out. So I'm just letting you know that I'm here, but I'm technically challenged. That's it.
Yeah, we noticed that you were popping in and out last week at the first
Yeah,
class.
it's like my
Yeah.
iPad commits suicide unpredictably, and
Oh no.
it needs to be replaced. It's like it's 10 years old, all that. But anyway,
Well,
so if I disappear, I'm not really gone.
right. Okay. Thank you for letting us know, Nanda. But we hope you have good luck and are able to stay in there.
Yeah.
And Amata seems to be having difficulty as well. So, but let's hope that we clear up some of that karma. So, but, yeah. Is there any other comments though on these two twin demons or okay. Anyone? All right. Well, again, like I said, I'm probably not going to write up a sort of mindfulness exercise each week, but I may give a little bit of advice by the end of tonight, depending on how far we get in the material for some things for you to pay attention to. And maybe I'll write these all down, and then in the future I can use them as a tool to actually hand out to people. But anyway, I'm kind of playing it as I go, so we'll see. So what I'd like to do to start off tonight is we were just about ready to start the text, and I want to go through just a few things in regard to the text because I actually realized that I didn't have things quite correct in regard to some of the outline. So remember that we have these, the required text is the one that you get for free, taking part in this program, and we have these recommended texts. In the first one and the third one, the verse numbers are in line with what we have in our translation. When it comes to the second one, though, Good Karma, How to Create the Causes of Happiness and Avoid the Causes of Suffering, Venerable Children's book, I had noticed already that there was some slight difference because it's based on Thupten Jinpa's translation. And I'll show you in a moment that there's some things that we need to even correct on the outline. I had already noticed that, but when I went in and I did this kind of schema for what pages you need to read and what book to kind of prepare in advance for the next class, I didn't have them correct for and I even didn't change this one yet. I'm going to have a revised copy of this that I will send to Colleen. So like even the one for tonight, I forgot to change that. I went forward and changed all of them. But essentially, we were going to prepare for verses 1 through 9. Well, for whatever reason, Thupten Jinpa put verses 4 and 5 together. So he would only be dealing with verses 1 through 8. So it's a little confusing. Let me go to the actual chart that shows you what these verses are. This is based on what was in Thupten Jinpa's text, the mind training text, where he has a translation of this. And so they did change the basic program folks in FPMT. And when they did this at Institut de Lama Tsongkhapa, where I used to study, they did change some of these going forward. But for some reason, they didn't change the first 3. But let me go ahead and introduce you to this outline. Again, this outline covers the 2 main topics of conventional bodhicitta, which overcomes the mind of self-cherishing, self-centeredness. And these are, again, says verses describing method practices aimed at attaining enlightenment for the sake of sentient beings. Again, they're kind of the method side of the path, the compassion side of the path. And then when we get to the latter part of the text, from verses 103 through 116, we're mostly dealing with ultimate bodhicitta there, which again is the antidote to self-grasping, the other of the 2 twin demons. Okay, so this is described as verses describing wisdom practices aimed at attaining enlightenment for the sake of sentient beings. So just know that again, and then there's a dedication verse. If you go to Venerable Children's book or even use Thupten Jinpa's translation, there's only 116 verses in it. And that's because these first few verses, as I said, within that first section, verses 4 and 5, he consolidated into a single verse. So he would only have here like verses 1 through, well, he has 1 through 7. What we need to do for our translation is to change this to 1 through 8. And I haven't been able to have somebody do that. I know, Bill, you did some modifications to a file one time. I can send you the original of this that doesn't have, I think maybe that's the one that you have, doesn't have the little slashes through it. I just did that for tonight so that we can know that this top part needs to be changed to 1 to 8. Then the next one, the next outline, practicing removing other suffering and giving them happiness, that's verse 9. And then when it comes to the next one, karmic cause and effect and their antidotes, that's 10 through 48. Because again, for whatever reason, the basic program folks for FPMT did change it going forward from here on. It's just that for the first part, they didn't have it quite correct. So again, this would be 1 to 8 at the top, then 9, and then 10 through 48. And we'll see that as we go through this, that those are the sections that things are divided into. So we're going to begin tonight, though, not right there with verse 1. We have a little bit of introductory stuff to do in regard to that. Let me get to the text. Okay. Actually, I was looking at it earlier and I went ahead of where we are. So, okay. So this is the text that is, again, on your reading list. This is the one that you've all been provided. And it's a commentary that was put together by my teacher, Geshe Jampa Gyatso, who I studied with in the master's program in Italy. It's called A Brief Word Commentary to the Mahayana Mind Training Wheel of Sharp Weapons. And this beginning verse, actually, in that very moment in which your name is seen, heard, and remembered, the seeds of apprehending a self are uprooted, and the wisdom realizing selflessness is developed. I bow down to Vajradhara, whose kindness is incomparable. This is actually a verse that was a homage from Trijong Tenpa Dargye's commentary. Geshe-la took it from another commentary because he liked it. He just thought it would be a nice way to start his own commentary. And Vajradhara, just so you know, is the tantric version of Buddha Shakyamuni. That is kind of the essential, quintessential tantric Buddha. And so this is already pointing to the fact that there will be some tantric references that we see in this as we go forward. So let's go ahead, and I'm not going to comment much more on that verse. Again, I don't think it requires too much commentary, but let's go into the actual text of Geshe-la's commentary. He says, this text is entitled so, meaning the Mahayana Mind Training Wheel of Sharp Weapons, because like a wheel of sharp weapons, it possesses great ability in destroying the enemy self-cherishing. Also at the very beginning, it says, it is called the wheel of sharp weapons that strikes the enemy's vital point. So this is kind of an alternate title for it, kind of adding a little bit more description. The wheel of sharp weapons, it strikes the enemy's vital point. The vital point, of course, is the point you have to hit in order to take down your enemy without it becoming, difficult. There's a lot of militaristic type stuff that goes on in this one, and particularly the wheel of sharp weapons right there in and of itself is a weapon that is used to destroy people, enemies. So again, we're not talking about actually destroying outer enemies. That's what this whole commentary is going to tell us. It's about the inner enemies. So among the two, Geshe-la says, among the two mentioned in the statement, in the world, the enemies who have physical form and the hinderers who are without form. So again, there's two types of enemies we can have. We can have enemies that are external to us, right? That are causing mayhem to us, problems for us. But the hinderers who are without form are the ones in our own minds. So he goes on to say the formless hinderers harm us through entering our mental continuum rather than harming us directly. But because the enemies who have a physical form harm our body and mind directly, we hold them to be our real enemies, right? Because we think they're the ones that are disturbing our peace and causing us problems because of the way they affect our minds, our bodies, what have you. Like this, Geshe-la says, here too our main and worst enemy, the one who has made us suffer from beginningless time, is our own self-cherishing. Now, some texts say they would include self-grasping. Remember, these are the twin demons, so they're going to be sometimes interchanged in kind of unusual ways. So don't think that even though self-cherishing might be singled out at times, that's all we're talking about. Both of these demons are the cause of so much suffering for us and for others. Then to conclude this, he says, therefore, through considering it to be our enemy, we must strike its vital point, get exactly where we need to overcome it. Since this text thoroughly hits the vital point of the enemy, self-cherishing, it is called the wheel of sharp weapons. Okay. So this is kind of, again, a little introduction to it. I want to go ahead and share the slides. Let me get those up on the screen. And then we can just do a little bit more on this kind of initial title. So the title of the text, again, this is what we just read. It is called the Wheel of Sharp Weapons. It strikes the enemy's vital point. Recall that what was said, that there are external enemies, those with form, which are held to be the real enemy, but are not, right? Those beings that we think are the real enemy. The internal enemies are those without form, which are the real enemy, of which the principal one is self-cherishing. And again, we can include self-grasping. I do want to mention this idea of the wheel. I found all these images out on the internet when I first put together this slideshow some years ago. And that's Vishnu, the Hindu god, with the traditional Indian weapon wheel. And so you'll see it's on his finger in the right hand, generally, is kind of a wheel. And that wheel is kind of tossed out. And the idea is that it goes forward and it ends up cutting down the enemies in front of you. That's how it's used as a weapon wheel. But what's kind of interesting is you can see kind of two meanings to this in terms of our own text. One of them is, of course, that we throw this wheel of sharp weapons out, the antidote to all of our problems, and it will strike the vital point of the real enemy, which is, again, the mind of self-cherishing and, of course, the mind of self-grasping as well. So that's kind of one idea behind it, is that we're going to use it, these teachings, in a similar mode to strike down the two real enemies that we have. But what's kind of interesting, it gets used also in a section coming up. We'll start it next week, actually, where we start looking at the fact that in a boomerang kind of fashion, the way that we sometimes send things out to get the other enemy that isn't the real enemy, right? The external enemies, the people we don't like, what have you, we send out a sort of action. We might say something, or we might do something physically, but it acts as kind of like a boomerang karmically to come back around and cut us. So there's kind of dual meanings to this wheel of sharp weapons. One is, again, the actual antidote to these two twin demons. And that's, again, what we're learning through going through this text is how to overcome these two. But then there's also this kind of karmic idea of us sending something out that comes back around to actually harm us. So let's go on and do the next section. The next section is the homage. The homage to, oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. The homage to Yamantaka. And we'll talk a little bit about what is meant by Yamantaka. Again, there are a lot of tantric allusions in this, and Yamantaka is one of them. So to the great wrathful one, Yamantaka, I pay homage. This line expresses worship to a special object, Geshe-la says. Moreover, if he were wrathful at anything, meaning Yamantaka, Yamantaka would be wrathful at the self-cherishing that is in the continua of sentient beings. Therefore, all bodhisattvas can be posited as being wrathful in that sense, because through their viewing self-cherishing to be the enemy, the real enemy, they are simply not asserted to be wrathful. They're not wrathful in that way, but they still have self-cherishing as the enemy. That's the main enemy that Yamantaka here in this initial homage is being praised for, the ability to cut through our self-centeredness and to adopt the mind that cherishes others. But obviously we're going to see later in the text Yamantaka kind of representing both forces, the force to overcome each of the twin demons through the mind of conventional bodhicitta and developing a mode of cherishing others that overcomes self-cherishing, self-centeredness, and then the wisdom realizing emptiness that overcomes the self-grasping that is the other of the two demons. So the Yamantaka in this context, Geshe-la says, the final great wrathful one is the definitive meaning to Yamantaka. Sometimes we talk about definitive versus interpretative. The definitive is what it really is driving towards. Interpretive is something that requires interpretation. It's more provisional. It's not the final meaning. So in this context, the final definitive meaning of Yamantaka is the exalted wisdom of non-dual bliss and emptiness. Right there is also an encapsulation of the goal of Tantra, highest yoga Tantra in particular, which is said to be the highest of the four types of Tantra. most of you have had some teachings in Tantra, even if you haven't had tantric initiations, and there are 4 levels, and each of them uses kind of a deeper and deeper methodology to help us to overcome all of the obstructions in our minds. And the highest yoga tantra is where you actually are working with subtle energies in the body to induce very blissful states. Together with that blissful state, you realize emptiness by in kind of having present what's called the mind of clear light. And in that way, you are able to actualize Buddhahood even more quickly. That's the advantage of the tantric path, is because you're using the nature of this very human body with its subtle elements and various factors to be able to achieve these very high states of mind and to realize emptiness together with the deity yoga, the visualization of yourself as the Buddhas that you've been initiated into, kind of visualize that together with these practices. It's very complex. We're not going to be getting into a whole thing on highest yoga tantra as part of this. But as I said, there are a lot of these references to tantric practice. We're going to see some of them tonight as well, and some of the other things that we look at. And it's just, what comes with this text. But again, it's not meant to be a tantric commentary as much as it is to help us to overcome on the sutra path these 2 demons that need to be overcome if we are ever to practice tantra in a very pure way. So again, that's the final one, the definitive meaning one. The interpretative meaning Yamantaka is wrathful Yamantaka, who appears in the aspect of that very form and shape. Again, that is how we are to interpret that figure of Yamantaka, who is one of the highest highest yoga deities that we have available to practice. So again, that figure that you've been seeing on some of the slides, that's Yamantaka. He has like 34 arms and I don't know, all these various legs, and there are like weapons in almost every hand or body parts of his enemies, and they're all just representing his ability to overcome both of these demons, actually, again, even though we're primarily talking about self-cherishing. Then it says the syllable chak, literally the honorific word for hand, and chaksel. You know this phrase chaksel. You probably have seen it when you recite various praises in Tibetan. Kind of the whole thing, chaksel kind of means to pay homage by seeking that in your hand, and then kind of to be granted that, to be able to achieve that. So that refers to this non-dual exalted wisdom, and the syllable sel, literally, the verb to seek, means I aspire just that. So it's kind of like, I seek to have this in my hand. I aspire just that. This phrase, chaksel, which we usually translate as pay homage. So let's go back. I'm going to toggle back and forth. I hope you don't mind it too much tonight. This is probably what we'll do to some degree going forward, is go back and forth between the slides and the commentary. So again, the homage, we saw the homage verse itself. Again, recall from our overall outline that the homage comes before conventional bodhicitta, which will be the first 102 verses, and then ultimate bodhicitta, and then the dedication. So this is another little kind of a mask of Yamantaka. Again, very fierce looking dude. To the great wrathful one, Yamantaka, I pay homage. 2 meanings of Yamantaka. Again, the definitive meaning, the kind of one that we're getting at, the final meaning, is the exalted wisdom of non-dual bliss and emptiness. Now, in some texts, they don't include kind of the deeper view of that. According to Tantra, they might just say the exalted wisdom of emptiness, which is, again, the main thing we are generating. But in Tantra, you're always doing it together with the practice of seeing yourself as the deity and generating great bliss. The interpretative meaning, again, is the wrathful Yamantaka, who, here's another image of it as well, appears in the aspect of that very shape and form. This is a statue of Yamantaka. You can see all the various arms and legs and what have you, or not the legs, but. Okay, so we're going on then to the first section of this, which according to our outline was practicing bodhisattvas transform afflictions and self-grasping into the path. So I think for this, maybe I will go ahead and show those, and then we'll at least do the verse. And actually, we're going to do 2 verses in this first part, verses 1 and 2, because they kind of go together. They're like a whole analogy that's being used here, and I'm going to explain it all, and then we'll go back and look at Geshe-la's commentary. So, whoops, I went to verse 2. Verse 1, just as when peacocks wander in jungles of lethal poison, Although there are extremely beautiful medicinal gardens, the flocks of peacocks do not delight in them, but instead are nourished by the essence of the lethal poison. Similarly, when the heroes, the bodhisattvas, enter the jungle of cyclic existence, although there are beautiful gardens of splendid happiness, the heroes do not become attached to them, for these brave-minded ones thrive in the jungle of suffering. So let me take it off for just a moment. I want to introduce kind of the main kind of idea in a lot of this text is this whole idea of transforming suffering into the path. Most of you have heard this in the light of Lojong mind training because it's one of the main practices. And when we get into the next section that will start next week, where we look at all these various suffering experiences that we're having, it's then when we start looking at, well, what do we need to keep in mind when we have certain things happening, like illness or whatever? We have to keep in mind the karmic occurrence that is, and use it to transform our mind so that we don't have our habitual responses to these things. Usually when we have suffering in our lives, we get quite upset. We start lashing out at other people that are causing that suffering. If there are people involved in it, we kind of lose it. We go back to those reactions that got us into that trouble in the first place. And that's also something we're going to be seeing as we go through that in regard to every specific form of suffering. There's quite unique ways that we are creating that karma. And we want to become cognizant of that so we can stop creating that karma once and for all and try to do the opposite, try to engage in more beneficial, helpful actions. That's the whole point of the Lojong teachings, or one of the main points, is to use whatever suffering we're experiencing as a doorway to wake up, to kind of recognize that we can do something differently, we can change our minds. So the analogy that's being used here of like the peacock is that and this isn't really, I think this is more mythology than it is anything that is grounded in reality. But there's a mythology around peacocks, and they think that if you read some of the texts, I think it's especially in the introduction in Peacock and the Poison Grove, the commentary by Geshe Sopa, in their introduction to that, they talk about how there are some snakes that peacocks can actually attack and not be harmed by the poison of them. And so I think that's where some of it comes from, some of the mythology. But the idea here is that these peacocks actually are said to be able to, according to this mythology, partake of what's called wolfsbane or aconite. Let me go ahead and put it on the screen here. Peacocks in this analogy, of course, are being compared to the bodhisattvas, right? Because we saw in verse 2, that's where the heroes came in, that the heroes are like the peacocks. Whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Shoot, I hit the wrong button. I was trying to go scroll down. Okay. The jungle that they are entering into is cyclic existence. So the peacocks are hanging out in the jungle, and the bodhisattvas are hanging out in cyclic existence, right? Continuing to work on developing their minds lifetime after lifetime, practice the 6 perfections, and so on. The poison, again, is in most texts it's referred to as, again, aconite or wolfsbane. This is the flower of that plant. And this is the suffering and afflictions that we experience, which of course is poison for most beings because, like the way that we react to our suffering often, it only creates more difficulties for us because we get angry and upset at the person inflicting suffering on us or the situation, and we end up creating negative karma, and then we create the causes for more suffering in the future. So again, the bodhisattvas don't see it as poison, though, just like the peacock doesn't see it as poison. Instead, the peacocks use that poison to develop even more lustrous feathers. This is the mythology of it. Whereas the bodhisattvas use it to develop even greater qualities, right, through the transformational effects of Lojong. Again, and they are not enticed by the medicinal gardens. The medicinal gardens are sort of compared to the splendid perfections of samsaric happiness. And there's really nothing perfect about samsaric things, because that's the whole problem, is that they don't have any perfection to them. They don't actually relieve our situation or change things in a very fundamental way. Instead, they become a trap for us. We go after them like, beings often go after the more beautiful things in the world and don't recognize the suffering we're creating for ourselves by virtue of that. So again, the bodhisattvas are comparable to the peacocks in terms of coming into cyclic existence. And instead of being attracted to all the pleasures and the delightful things of samsara, They go right for the difficult stuff, right for the places where they know they're going to get challenged and where things are going to be useful for them. And not that they don't really want beings to be kind of ornery and awful to them, but when beings are doing that, well, then this is like, roll up your sleeves, it's time to do the work. This is the good stuff. Many of you again have studied the 8 verses, and Colleen sent out a copy to everyone. I also put it in the chat box, but those verses are a summation, and a number of them, of this sort of practice where we see everyone who is very difficult for us as being like a precious treasure, as being like someone who we really can value, because they give us something that everybody who's nice to us doesn't, right? Everybody who's nice to you gives you lots of wonderful, things that you can enjoy, and pleasant experiences. But the people who are difficult for you really give you the stuff to work with. So this is how we change our minds using the Lojong techniques. So let's go to the commentary and go through what Geshe-la says. I just wanted to kind of introduce those 2 verses through those slides, and we'll go back to them in a moment. But this is again verse 1. I don't need to read it again, but it's all the first side of the analogy, looking at the peacocks who, again, don't go to the medicinal gardens. Instead, they take the lethal poison for other beings that is actually useful for making their feathers more lustrous. And then similarly, bodhisattvas go right to the jungle of suffering, instead of getting caught up in the splendid happiness of the beautiful gardens of samsara. So this says in the commentary, moreover, when peacocks wander in jungles of lethal poison, no matter how many medicinal gardens beautified with flowers, stems, fruit, and so on that there are, they do not delight in them. Since the splendid coloring of the peacocks' bodies is increased by the essence of the lethal poison, desiring just that, the peacocks seek it out and thrive on it. So again, that they head right for the wolfsbane, that all other beings would die from eating. This is their medicine. This is how they actually, increase their qualities, their beauty. Like this, what do those who neglect themselves do? The beings who act solely for the welfare of sentient beings, the heroes, enter the jungle of cyclic existence, right? Bodhisattvas do something similar to the peacocks. That's why it's being used here as an analogy for the mind training teachings. So then it continues, cyclic existence itself, due to the root delusions of attachment, hatred, and ignorance, or sometimes referred to as delusion. In that case, it would be specifically the ignorance that is at the root of samsara, is like a dense jungle, so overgrown that the sky cannot be seen, and we can't even see reality because we're so continually bound to these 3 delusions. When the heroes, the great beings, enter it, no matter how much the splendid perfections of happiness, such as gain, respect, a good reputation, fame, and so forth, these are on the list of the 8 worldly dharmas. Many of you know these, right? Gain, getting gain, avoiding loss, having good respect, people thinking of well of you, good reputation, avoiding the opposite of those, as well as having pleasurable experiences, avoiding unpleasant ones. This is what most beings get caught up in, right? So the bodhisattvas don't go there, though. They, although they resemble beautiful flower gardens, as it said here, seeing them, the bodhisattvas comprehend their disadvantages, the way in which they bring suffering results, and so on. Due to this, just as peacocks do not delight in medicinal gardens, the heroes do not become attached to these perfections in the slightest way. No matter how much suffering there is in cyclic existence, in the same way that peacocks enjoy lethal poison, the heroes take it as an aid to the thorough completion of the enlightened conduct. It's the way you achieve enlightenment, through practicing patience in the midst of people being angry at you, and practicing generosity when people are taking things from you, whatever. You can practice the 6 perfections within that, as well as all the other bodhisattva behavior. So from the point of view of their willingness to accept suffering, these great brave-minded ones thrive on it. So again, this is kind of putting forth one of the main themes that we're going to see in the text, this idea of being able to transform, transmute an experience of suffering into the result of happiness. Not that you're going to, in that moment, experience no pain, and the goal shouldn't be to kind of do away with these things so that they don't happen in our life. It's to acknowledge that they do happen. Every one of us has unpleasant things that happen every day of our life, some lesser, some greater, and we need to learn how to work with those. Now, in the traditional Lojong teachings, they also do go in how to work with happiness and transmute it into the path. Because what happens when we have pleasurable experiences? Start grasping at them, and the desirous mind doesn't want to separate from those. And we're going to learn, again, most of you know the technique of Tonglen. Tonglen is a powerful way to work with either of those situations. Things are suffering, we can kind of take them into ourselves, think that we're taking on other beings' suffering. If we are having something that is happiness, we can give it away to others. So again, we're going to be pursuing this further, but this is, as I said, kind of introducing the initial sort of theme of this text. I might mention that Venerable Chodron, when she talks about this in her book, she mentions that these are Arya Bodhisattvas who are being referred to here. It's a little unclear from our text as to who this is. I mean, an Arya Bodhisattva, this word Arya is usually translated as superior. This means bodhisattvas who have actually had ultimate bodhicitta experience. They have developed the mind realizing emptiness directly. So they're on that kind of side of the path that is where they're headed towards removing completely all the obscurations, as opposed to bodhisattvas before that that are building up to that initial insight into emptiness in a very direct, non-conceptual way. So again, I can't say for sure, who this is. I don't know Venerable Chodron's commentary. It's not that it's not reliable. I'm not saying that. It's just there are different perspectives on this in terms of who's being referred to here. But obviously, this isn't us yet, right? I can speak for myself, at least. I'm not going running after all the sufferings in cyclic existence and trying to, find them and be kind of putting myself in difficult situations and avoiding all the pleasant, wonderful, delightful things. We're not there yet. This text is to help us to train like this, so eventually we can become like those bodhisattvas. I might mention that in the little commentary by Geshe Nalandargi, I think it is, yeah, small book that's on your book list as well, that again is out of print. There are 5 points of similarity between bodhisattvas and peacocks, and I'm going to actually add a 6th one that one of the other commentators mentioned. First, just as the colors of the peacock's feathers grow more radiantly brilliant when they eat plants that are poisonous to other animals, bodhisattvas shine with blissful happiness by making use of such poisonous delusions as desire and attachment for the benefit of others. And again, by using whatever is suffering on the path, what have you. We're going to talk more about this concept of using desire and attachment. Secondly, just as peacocks have 5 crown feathers, bodhisattvas have the attainment of the 5 paths to enlightenment. So when I was talking about Arya bodhisattvas, whoops, let me go into this. There are 5 paths. Most of you have heard teachings on this before. The path of accumulation, or merit as Rinpoche used to call it, is when you enter into the path. Once you have an uncontrived conventional bodhicitta, you start there and you begin to accumulate all the kind of positive potential that gets you to the next path. The next path is the path of preparation, where you're preparing for that direct insight into emptiness that happens on the path of seeing. And then you get to the path of meditation, where you acquaint yourself with that again and again to remove more and more layers of obscurations. And then you finally achieve what's called the path of no more learning. Path of no more learning is where you become a Buddha. There's not really a bodhisattva path. You're a bodhisattva up to that point, and then you become a Buddha on the 5th one, the final one. So again, it's just pointing out that I'm not going to go into great detail on those 5, but that is one similarity. I don't know if there are actually 5 crowns or 5 parts to a peacock's head. I have never counted them. Number 3, just as the sight of a peacock's colorful display gives us great pleasure, the sight of a bodhisattva uplifts our mind because of their bodhicitta. Perhaps some of you, again, have had experiences of that happening when you see His Holiness or other great beings who have the bodhisattva attitude and are displaying that in their lives, and it can really uplift our minds, our gurus, and so on. 4th, just as peacocks live mostly on poisonous plants and never eat insects or cause harm to others, bodhisattvas never cause even the slightest harm to other beings. Actually, yeah, that was the one that was added in another text, but it was right here. It's the 4th one, so I don't need to have a 6th one for this. That's number 4. Okay, and then 5, just as peacocks eat poisonous plants with pleasure, when bodhisattvas are offered sensory objects, although they have no attachment to them, they accept them with pleasure to allow the donor to gain merit. This is maybe, again, part of like how they are transmuting attachment as well, is that they don't have the actual attachment to objects, but they are happy to receive objects, to receive offerings from beings and so on, so that they can create the causes for those beings to gain merit from that. Okay. So then we're going to go to the first part of verse 3 that continues with this analogy, kind of commenting on it. Because of what we just said, those who are under the power of the cowardice that eagerly pursues happiness and pleasure spend their time in suffering. Meaning, kind of, you have these heroes, these brave bodhisattvas who go to those dark places, who want to happily be in difficult suffering situations. Whereas the cowardly, those who don't have that mind, are continually going right to the things that bring pleasure. They're, kind of being enticed by the pleasures of samsara. So let's look at actually the commentary on this before we go on to the next part of it. Geshe-la broke the commentary up into two parts. The reason for saying because of that at the beginning is that since this is the case, what we just talked about in the first two verses, we should willingly accept suffering. Whereas contrary to that, due to the influence of self-cherishing, from beginningless time, we have been under the power of the cowardly mind that puts effort into eagerly pursuing our own happiness, pleasure, and so forth. Due to this, we have met with nothing but suffering in the past. Furthermore, if even now we still do not turn away from it, we will spend our time only in suffering until the end of our future lives. So again, it's just essentially pointing out the fact that from a bodhisattva perspective, again, this mind of self-cherishing is causing us to engage in things that are not going to be wholesome for us in the long term. We keep chasing after samsaric pleasures. And sometimes even when we engage in Dharma practice, we're only going as far as we feel kind of comfortable. I only want to be in kind of my own little comfort zone. I don't necessarily want to go on that retreat where they do those kinds of practices or this type of thing that I might, benefit from. But I just feel like it's outside of what I want to do, right? We have our own little preferences. So our Dharma practice can even become tainted with some subtle level of self-cherishing when we're not, engaging in things wholeheartedly. It takes a lot of effort and enduring a lot of difficulty to accomplish the path to enlightenment. And we have to be like those brave bodhisattvas who are like the peacocks, who are going after those difficult situations and happy to engage in them because they see the benefits and they see the disadvantages of not doing that. Continuing to experience the sufferings of samsara and be in an unenlightened state, and moreover, others continuing to suffer because we are not yet able to help them to the degree that we would like to. So then the last part of verse 3, while the brave-minded ones who willingly accept suffering are always happy due to the strength of their courage. So compared to the previous, right? They're pursuing happiness and pleasure. They end up spending their time in suffering. They're in, the suffering of samsara, maybe not in a grosser way, but certainly they're still going to be under the control of those factors of karma and delusions, going from life to life and so on. So Geshe-la comments on the counterpart, which again are the bodhisattvas, those whose minds have become superior to that cowardice, the great brave-minded ones who possess the strength of mind that willingly accepts the sufferings of all sentient beings, are very courageous. By the strength of their courage, not only in this life, but also in their entire string of future lives, they will continually go from one happiness to another. In this way, they will always be happy. In fact, there's a verse I meant to look up before tonight from Master Shantideva's text, which is actually also a major text that's used as a support for many of the Lojong teachings. I think it's in verse 7. It's like the idea of bodhisattvas going from life to life, experiencing greater and greater happiness, even though they're involved in practices where they're willingly enduring suffering, willingly being in difficult situations. It brings more and more happiness because this is how we actually make spiritual progress. And we need those challenging situations. We're going to get a whole slew of them. When we get into verses 10 through 48, every verse is going to show us, if we're experiencing a particular thing, what the action was that we did that got us into that trouble. So we have to acknowledge that everything that we meet is giving us that opportunity to learn, to actually overcome that through doing the opposite and learning to endure that suffering with this brave-minded attitude. Yeah, I think that's probably commentary on that. Let's go on to the next verse. I'm going to jump back to the slides just to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Okay, so verse 4. Verse 4 is actually also in your discussion. Verses 1 and 2 were in your discussion questions or homework questions. So this one is also there. Presently, attachment is like a jungle of lethal poison. It is overcome by the peacock-like heroes, but takes the life of the crow-like cowards. So they're using an analogy here of like crows versus peacocks. And the crows, apparently, if they were to eat the aconite, the wolfsbane, they would die. It would be poison to them. Whereas the peacocks, again, can utilize that poison to make their feathers even more beautiful. So again, this is pointing the difference between beings who are not capable of practicing it that way versus beings who are. Now, the very beginning, where it says attachment is like a jungle of lethal poison. Let's look at the commentary from Geshe Chönyi. He's the abbot of Kopan currently. He was also the resident teacher at our center in Singapore, and that's where he gave these teachings that I'm quoting here. So the jungle that we saw in that verse is a metaphor here for attachment or desire. Desire is specifically singled out because it is something that arises very easily in our mental continua. And even when it arises, it's very difficult. Well, there was an extra word in there. I copied this from the commentary, just did a highlight of it and threw it in there. I'll get rid of that. It is very difficult for us to identify and know that it has arisen. Attachment's very subtle. It's kind of like, again, together often with the twin demons, and it's kind of arising on the basis of our being attracted to an object. It's like we get sucked into the object, and it's very hard to peel off that bit of attachment that is exaggerating the qualities of that object. Desire can be generated towards both inanimate and animate objects. By focusing on a single object, many different kinds of desire can arise with respect to the object's shape, its color, its texture, its smell, and so forth. Therefore, desire is likened to a very powerful, deadly poison, because again, it sucks us in and causes us to overlay on whatever it is that we are experiencing a level of attraction that is not actually there. All of these are things that we karmically are having a propensity to be attracted to, and we think that they're the best things in the world, and we go chasing after those objects. This is the jungle of samsara we're caught up in, is we're primarily being driven by kind of having desire towards those objects. Venerable Rabina, when she teaches, she often talks about how these three root poisons that we have, I mentioned ignorance is kind of at the root of all of it, particularly the ignorance that is self-grasping. But the other two are kind of the attachment. Desire comes up because we get something pleasant and we don't want to be separated from it. But she often highlights how what happens over here on the side of like aversion or anger is what happens when attachment doesn't get what it wants. So we see that kind of the most kind of primal urge we have is to be attracted to things, to think that things are going to bring us some measure of happiness. They do bring us some pleasure, but they don't bring us real happiness, because through the mind of attachment, we often, again, are creating an unhealthy reaction to those objects. And we then often create karma that is non-virtuous in relation to those objects. And then, of course, when we don't get what attachment wants, then we have the mind of anger and aversion and hatred and what have you. And that mind, of course, gets us into all kinds of trouble as well. So again, what Geshe Chönyi is pointing out is that we can see in this verse kind of the bigger picture of the jungle of samsara primarily being a realm of desire. And of course, the desire realm, the human realm, is located in the desire realm. That's why we have this particular label for it, is because it's a place where desire is created quite readily. All the various things that we can be attracted to in regard to even a particular object. So the heroes or bodhisattvas are able to utilize desire as a method to benefit other sentient beings, but ordinary beings are unable to do this. Why is there this difference in ability to use and transform desire? The bodhisattvas are able to employ desire to benefit others because they have no self-cherishing whatsoever. So what do we mean by utilizing desire? There are different teachings on this too, and the number of commentaries that I've been looking at and preparing to teach this again. But we can certainly see that in the tantric path, I mentioned tantra several times tonight, right? In the tantric path, that is the whole process of transformation of the mind through utilizing the energy of desire. So when we see desire arising in our minds in the tantric path, It's a doorway for us to see that the pleasure, the bliss that is created when we are in that desirous state for an object that brings us that pleasure. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the overlay of the attachment mind, the mind that thinks that those qualities are inherent in the object and then again exaggerates them and makes them into something much more than what's actually there. All of that happens because of our habitual mind of desire and attachment. But we can utilize the energy of desire in a very skillful way, especially in highest yoga tantra. Again, I'm not going to go into all of that because once more, this isn't strictly a tantric teaching. We're primarily going to be looking at the sutra aspects of this. Again, sutra being the more common teachings that the Buddha gave, the teachings that actually help us to get to be able to practice tantra at some point because we've trained our mind well on the sutra path. Even in the sutra path, though, there are instances where we point to kind of the use of desire as a tool to help us to accomplish the path, to engage in the perfections and so on. It's not highlighted as much in the sutras, but nonetheless, there's things like, for example, there are some kings who were bodhisattvas who did procreate. You know, they would have children because then those children could become Dharma protectors in a sense. They could be brought up within the Dharma and they could become instruments of helping the Dharma to progress in that land or what have you. So to procreate does require some desire, right? Does require the initial, sort of sexual desire and what have you in order for that to happen. So they say that many bodhisattvas don't kind of go about abandoning those initially because they want to utilize them on the path, to be able to use those in a kind of skillful way. And then, of course, we can even see with regard to situations where desire could arise. And that's the kind of way that I would encourage you to think about it in terms of when the bodhisattvas encounter something such as, a pleasant situation or whatever, they don't have the mind of attachment arising. They instead engage in practices that will be of benefit. They can receive gifts from people who have beautiful things to offer to help them, as I said earlier, to complete their practice of generosity towards them. They can, at that moment, think about the disadvantages of pursuing that mind of attachment and lessen their own attachment rather than getting sucked up into those objects of desire. And there are a lot of different ways that obviously bodhisattvas can work with it. If we look at the stages of the path, again, there are those 3 levels. At the very first level, it's primarily a practice of kind of stopping the physical and verbal actions that create the really heavy-duty karma that we have to experience in samsara. At the second level, the middle scope, is where we begin to work on the mind and lessening the afflictions because the goal there is to be liberated from the afflictions. But those on the fundamental vehicle path tend to practice by isolating themselves from objects of desire. This is why, for example, the Thai forest monks and what have you that are very strict about who they're around and what they do. They don't go into the towns except to seek their alms, and then they go right back to the monasteries, to the forest, what have you. So again, there's a tendency on the lesser paths, the person of the least capacity, the person of middling capacity, to not be around objects of desire. But for bodhisattvas, and especially those on the tantric path, they use desire, they use those situations, and even what comes up for them when you're dealing with difficult things. And one commentator did say that when desire is used here in regard to that verse, it's meant to also include all the other delusions. For bodhisattvas, when they're in an environment where delusions are going to arise because of attractive things or unattractive things, they once more look at this as like, it's time to practice. They're happy to be around those things. They're not around them because then they can go after all those pleasant objects and increase their desire. They're not about to do that. They're not also about to get angry and upset at the things that are producing pain and suffering for them. Instead, they see it as a doorway, an opportunity to practice. And so in that way, we can see these different views of how to use desire in the path. And I put together an answer to that question in regard to verse 4. That isn't really encompassing all of that, but nonetheless, this is the concept, is that bodhisattvas can use afflictions at times as a doorway through which they can practice. At the tantric level, you can practice using those subtle energies that come with those delusions. But even at the sutra level, you can see that there are times when bodhisattvas will utilize desire and so on in a skillful way, rather than getting, again, sort of sucked up into the habitual patterns that we have, the more reactive ways that we work with those things, those objects. And then Geshe Choni continues, he says, for ordinary beings like us, however, until we have overcome our self-cherishing, there's no way that we can transform any of the mental poisons, ignorance, anger, and attachment, into an aid to accomplish something beneficial. It just won't happen for us. This is kind of also highlighting that, we need to make sure that we practice the path in a, kind of a logical manner. Don't think that you're going to kind of instantly be able to engage in all of this high level mind training, Lojong type of stuff right from the get-go if you haven't trained in the other aspects of the path, right? That's actually something that I'll point out in a moment when we go back to the verse. It says here, until we destroy our self-cherishing, any attempt to utilize the afflictions would be of no benefit for the attainment of our own liberation and enlightenment. Destroy might be kind of harsh. Until we at least lessen our self-cherishing, then we are not going to make real great progress in terms of moving in the direction of liberation and enlightenment. Okay. Again, the crows are the cowardly beings. Don't need to do much more on that. Let me go back, though, to that commentary and just point out something in the verse. I didn't mention this when we went through it. Right where it says there, presently, we haven't even gone through the commentary, right? So we got to do that. Where it says presently, attachment is like a jungle of lethal poison. This means that in our situation where we ideally will be at, as I said, at the great level, the third level of the stages of the path, having practiced the other two well, having learned them well. So this is requiring some initial training in those other two levels of the stages of the path, the Lam Rim. And that is actually what Geshe-la says to some degree here. It's kind of inferred in his commentary. He says, presently, that is on this occasion of training the mind in the path of great beings, which it requires one to be trained in the mind of the least capable beings and the middling capable beings. As I pointed out last week, there's mind training at all three levels. The level we're working at is that of the great being, but that requires training in the other two levels. So here we are now, boundless attachment, like a jungle of lethal poison, is very abundant. That too is overcome by the peacock-like great heroes. That is, they are able to carry it into the path. Whereas if the crow-like cowards experience it, in addition to their not being able to carry it into the path, it also counteracts the path to liberation, because by being closer to those objects of desire, they might create more attachment and so on. As I mentioned, that's why in the fundamental vehicle, there's often an idea of isolating yourself from those objects of attachment and so on. That says, for example, if peacocks eat even lethal poison, they will certainly overcome it. While if, for that reason, crows eat it, unlike the peacocks, they will die. So then he does talk about this as being, kind of the meaning of where we're at ideally in practicing this text. He says, those who have not previously trained their minds in the paths of small and middling beings are not able to carry attachment into the path. Because we have to have worked with our attachment at those levels and seen it for what it is, and then have the mind of bodhicitta that is kind of cherishing other beings, wanting to become a Buddha for their sake. We need that type of mindset to engage in these practices and have it be successful. And certainly you need to have all three levels of the sutra presentation of the Lam Rim, the stages of the path, before you can engage in Tantra. Of course, in Tantra, we summarize those three levels as being the minds of bodhicitta, renunciation, and the wisdom realizing emptiness. These are the three principal aspects of the path. I think I've taught that for all of you up there previously. It's a way that we can encapsulate everything that is taught on the Lam Rim in the sutra presentation as the preparatory practices for engaging in Tantra. So the main point that was being made there is that there is an ability as one progresses through the path to be able to use attachment and desire, not just sufferings, but even the minds of attachment and desire in a very skillful way. That's not going to be the main emphasis of this text again, because that's a pretty high level practice. Again, I kind of concur with what Venerable Chodron is saying, that this is probably at an Arya level, a pretty high level of realization. But nonetheless, we can still engage in much of the trainings that are being set out in this text. We can begin to look at our own situation through the lens of Lojong and actually changing things, how we're perceiving things and so on. So now we have verse 5. So how can the selfish overcome this poison? How can those who are still selfishly driven, self-centered, overcome this poison? If they are also similarly involved in the other afflictions, these afflictions will cost the crow-like their life. So again, as long as we continue to be engaged in the pleasures of samsara and continue to chase after them, it's only going to mean our death in a sense, because we just keep living and dying and never really achieving any real lasting solution to our problems. You might get a good rebirth every now and then through the force of good actions, but that's not good enough. So it says there in the commentary from Geshe-la, also for the poison of attachment and so forth to become a method for accomplishing others' welfare, it is necessary to completely eliminate the snare of selfishness. Selfishness, again, selfishness is used as equivalent to self-centeredness or self-cherishing. Since those who desire their own happiness are not able to do this, they will not overcome this poison, and will also be similarly involved in the other afflictions, such as hatred, delusion, miserliness, jealousy, and so forth. While the heroes are able to transform these afflictions into a method for accomplishing the path, if the crow-like cowards, such as the hearers, solitary realizers, and so forth, those are the two main practitioners in the fundamental vehicle. Again, those that are practicing primarily the middle scope, informed by the small scope of the Lam Rim. They're not doing it within the context of bodhicitta at all. They're just doing it for their own liberation. If they indulge in them, in addition to their not being able to transform them into such a method, the afflictions, as mentioned above, will also cost these people the life of liberation. That is, they will cut its life vein. They won't even be able to attain the goal that they are seeking, their liberation. This concludes with a small statement that is kind of important. There is, not that important, but anyway, it's important to have it delineated. There is a difference between the two. Being transformed into a method for accomplishing others' welfare, in other words, for benefiting other beings, and two, being carried into the path. We've been using this term, kind of taking the delusions into the path, and that's the way it's usually referred to in a tantric sense. Because as I said, the bodhisattvas, they want to kind of keep that mind of desire so that they can utilize the energy of desire on the path of Tantra. You need that energy. This is why I always wonder, those beings, hearers and solitary realizers who complete the fundamental vehicle path, they've gotten rid of their desire. So it makes me wonder how they ever practice Tantra, because you kind of need to have that desire. You need to have some sort of energy to work with to trigger the very subtle energies in the body and to induce these subtler states of mind that are the basis for practicing Tantra, as I mentioned earlier tonight. So that's what we mean by the second one. The other one, in terms of how Geshe-la describes this, where we talk about being transformed into a method for accomplishing others' welfare or for benefiting them. This is kind of like assisting on our path. It's usually only attachment for this. It's not necessarily the other ones, whereas you can use the anger energy in the tantric path. It's hard to think of using anger to benefit other beings. Maybe there might be some rare situations, but you can use desire. And he says here, that some there is a difference between these two. In other words, some afflictions can be transformed into a method for accomplishing the welfare of others, but cannot be carried into the path. And these are, again, highlighted to be things, like I mentioned, where they might use their desire to procreate, to be able to have children who can then carry forward the bodhisattva training and be a protector of the Dharma, or those sorts of things. I think there, again, were a few other examples. But the idea is that you want to be able to use what you have in terms of your existence with some kind of moments of desire to be able to benefit beings, use it for their welfare in this world. Whereas taking it into the path, where you use the energy of those delusions, is really only done on Tantra. So that's, as I understand, what Geshe-la was presenting there, just to know a fine difference between kind of a sutra and a Tantra presentation of how to utilize desire on our spiritual training. Let's go back to the commentary. I don't think I have anything more to say about that one. Now we're on to verse 6, and we get the first 3 lines of 6. It says, because of this, the peacock-like brave-minded ones combine the afflictions, which are like a jungle of poison, into an elixir and enter the jungle of cyclic existence. So for this reason, Geshe-la says, the great peacock-like brave-minded ones combine the very strong and abundant afflictions, which are like a jungle of lethal poison. Again, for ordinary beings, we'd be like the crows. We would eat it and it would kill us, or it would keep us from attaining, liberation, even because we just have more delusions around those objects. It combines them into an elixir and enter the jungle of cyclic existence, which is transformed into a method for accomplishing others' welfare. Moreover, the way in which they combine them into an elixir is, if illustrated with respect to attachment, that when they have a perfect dwelling place, for instance, and due to enjoying it generate attachment to living there, at that time, through thinking about this, they do not come under the power of this bad mind. So he's using this example. There are a few others that were set out in some of the other commentaries about when you have something that is going to induce attachment or desire in you, such as a beautiful home. Maybe some of you live in a really beautiful home that you've gotten quite attached to over the years of staying there. And when you have that kind of begin to arise, that you actually think about how this is an opportunity for you to use these ideal situations, this beautiful home that you possess, as a support for your spiritual development. And you can even, of course, think about, may others have this type of situation? May they also have the protection of a nice place to live, and so on. You can think about offering it to them, again, through the practice of Tonglen that we'll touch on shortly, but we'll get into more detail next week. So there are lots of ways that, again, we can see it in a much kind of coarser way. We can see how much our mind of attachment or anger, whatever arises in regard to various things, and we can use that as a touchstone to be able to cultivate an antidote to self-cherishing by thinking of others, by not wanting to harm them at those times and what have you. So that's, again, the way that we're primarily going to be working with it ourselves, because as was pointed out, and I mentioned earlier, these are probably pretty high-level bodhisattvas that are able to use attachment in those ways that I've talked about, or some of the other afflictions, especially on the tantric path. This was Geshe-la was saying, even in his commentary, without having addressed the self-cherishing mind, it's very hard to utilize these afflictions on the path. So it's not something we can do quite so easily. So I think I went through that commentary. Let's go through 6D, and then I'm going to go back to the slides to make sure I didn't forget something. 6D says, while willingly accepting these sufferings and delusions and whatever, they should destroy the poison. This is kind of this tantric idea, is that when we are talking about utilizing the energy of attachment, it's so that we can overcome attachment. You don't create more attachment. You actually use the energy of it as a means to be rid of it. So also, Geshe-la says, when they utilize desirable objects and so forth for the welfare of others, while lacking selfishness, conceit, and so on, internally they should have the fear that comprehends their disadvantages and so forth. And externally, when offered desirable objects, they should willingly accept them as though delighting in them in order for others to complete the collection of merit. If they do this by the force of contemplating their disadvantages, not only will the desirable objects and so forth not be able to harm them, but also the potency of the afflictions will be destroyed. Hence, it is mentioned in this way. So again, there's different ways of practicing with this, but the idea is that whatever situation where the delusions will tend to come up, we have to work with some sort of transformation, transmutation of that experience. Whether it be, again, if somebody's giving you something very desirable, that you then complete it for the sake of them being able to accumulate that merit, take it from them, and you can do something else with it. I mean, Rinpoche was very much like this. People would make him these beautiful offerings, and then he would just give them to other people. You have to kind of act as a conduit for people to be able to accumulate this merit. But again, in the tantric path, we are continually trying to use the energy of desire to kind of overcome desire, to kind of rip it out from the roots. And that's also kind of being referred to some degree in that verse. All right, let's go back to the slides just to see again what I had there. Verse 5, verse 6, verse 6. Okay. So let's go ahead and do this first part on the screen. Just read it here, and then we'll go to the commentary. Once more, we have that word presently, meaning at this time, for those circling without freedom, for those who are under the control of delusions and so on. self-grasping is Mara's messenger. This word Mara is, probably have heard of the four Maras. There are kind of these four forces that we are trying to overcome in the story of the Buddha attaining enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. These four kind of manifested in various ways, but I'll go into them in a moment. But their idea is that self-grasping is Mara's messenger. It's kind of the comes along with the Mara, the demon, is often translated as demon of self-cherishing. So you kind of have the messenger and you have the being that sends the message through the messenger, kind of the controller of it or whatever. While parting from the happinesses of selfishness and hedonism, we should willingly accept hardships for the welfare of others. This is kind of introducing this idea of kind of enduring hardships and suffering, whereas other beings are just going to be under the control of their delusions and not be able to do that sort of transmutation. So for most beings, this is what they're under the control of, these twin demons. Now, it is kind of interesting. I did see in Venerable Chodron's book that they actually reverse the roles. They say self-grasping is the Mara and self-cherishing is the messenger. But nonetheless, our text says the opposite. Let's go through this and then I'll talk about it a little bit more because it is a little confusing. The main thing that makes all sentient beings, exemplified here by the hearers, solitary realizers, and so forth, which again would include all other beings, anyone who's not a bodhisattva, it seems, that the main thing that makes them engage in circling in the abodes of cyclic existence without working toward Buddhahood is self-cherishing. Therefore, we must act against it. Thus, there is a difference between the two, self-grasping and self-cherishing. Whereas self-cherishing itself is a Mara, a demon, its messenger is self-grasping. These two exist in the manner of master and servant, seemingly self-cherishing being the master, self-grasping being the servant. Now, as I said, you're going to see this later. I think it's around verse 51 or something, where it's going to be reversed, where they're going to be talking about it in kind of an opposite way. So again, don't hold too fast to these explanations because once more we're dealing with the twin demons that are kind of elusive. Well, sometimes things will appear to be more self-cherishing, sometimes more self-grasping, but they're often together. That's why we call them the twin demons. In most ordinary beings' minds, they are arising in tandem. So through parting from both the master, self-cherishing, and their servant, self-grasping, as well as the happiness of selfishness, the happiness of hedonism, and so forth, we should not come under the influence of the desires of these two. In other words, that's our job, is to kind of part from the normal habitual patterns of falling into the self-cherishing, self-grasping, what have you. So again, this idea of self-cherishing being a Mara, I might just mention real briefly the four Maras. The four Maras, three of them are internal. And we think about this demons or whatever, maybe being something outside of ourselves. We have the demons within us. The first is the demon of the afflictions itself, that all of the afflictions can be encapsulated into that. That's a demon for us. That's something causing us lots of pain and suffering and difficulty. Then we have the Mara of the aggregates, meaning the body and mind that we are appropriating in each life. Each life we there's a continuum of mind, but we have a particular mind, such as a human mind in this existence, and then together with a human body and all the things that come with that, that whole package is a demon because it's under the control of karma and delusions. We don't choose this in a sense of like it being some sort of ideal perfect state. We are forced into these existences through the power of our past actions and the delusions that drove us into those states. Then we have the Mara of death, the Lord of death. It's sometimes personified as Yama. Back when I was talking about Yamantaka, I didn't really explain the derivation of his name. Yamantaka means kind of the destroyer of death, and Yama is the personification of death. And so this third Mara is kind of called the Lord of Death or Yama, but it's really just the fact that we are subject to death because there is no kind of death personified. This is just a symbol for death that is used, Yama. Yama is on the wheel of life, kind of holding the wheel with his claws. You might have seen that picture of the wheel of life. Anyway, these three, again, we are subject to the afflictions. We are subject to the aggregates and being kind of embodied through of our karma and delusions, and then we are subject to death. And by death, then we are reborn. The whole process starts over again when this life ends. The fourth Mara is actually called the son of the gods, the Devaputra. And that is actually said to be an actual being, that if you have the karma with that being, it can be a sort of spirit influence on you that can cause different states of mind to arise more readily. It kind of compared to like Cupid, when like Cupid shoots an arrow and then you fall in love. And it was in like all those little cartoons we saw when we were kids. And so it's like a similar thing. Devaputra kind of shoots you with an arrow of envy or an arrow of greed or whatever, and then those manifest. Now, whether there's an actual being or not, I don't know. This is how it's described. But nonetheless, we see Maras are kind of malevolent forces that we have to contend with. Most of them created, or all of them really, created by our own minds through the force of, our mental patterns or karma or what have you. But that's what kind of keeps us in this, cyclic existence. We have to see that self-cherishing is like that. It's like another factor that is keeping us from engaging in the practices that will lead to Buddhahood and achieving our full potential. And self-grasping is kind of its messenger. They do say that the messenger kind of comes ahead. Like if the king or the master wants to send something to, let people know that you're coming, you send the messenger ahead. You don't go first, and then the messenger comes later. That's the connotation of a messenger. So in that way, we can see that it makes some sense that usually for us, self-grasping comes first, and then we cherish the self and hold it to be most important. Again, but these two, as I said, do get kind of interchangeable at times and even very hard to discern. So let's go on to verse 8. I want to try to get to at least through 8 if we can't. We've got 7d yet. The final line, again, we should willingly accept hardships for the welfare of others. Geshe-la simply says we should turn away from selfishness and so forth. That is, we should willingly undertake others' welfare in general, as well as the welfare of others that is particularly difficult to undertake. In other words, feel fully embracing whatever suffering you have to experience. Suffering that's part of the path, suffering that is simply the experiences that you have that are unsatisfactory. All of this can be transmuted, can become part of our path. So now we go on to verse 8. Verse 8 says, the sufferings of all beings who are similar in kind is being driven by actions and habituated to the afflictions should be heaped upon us hedonists. So again, the sufferings of beings who are similar in kind to us and being driven by actions, karma, and being habituated to the delusions, the afflictions, should be heaped on us hedonists. This is beginning to talk about this practice of Tonglen that we'll go into in more detail next week. But this is pointing out this idea of taking on the suffering of others. When we see others experience suffering due to their own karma and delusions, we should be willing to take it upon ourselves to destroy our own hedonism, our own kind of being obsessed with worldly pleasures and self-cherishing. So the commentary says, we who wander without freedom in the abodes of cyclic existence and experience only suffering are driven by the bad actions we have accumulated under the power of self-cherishing and habitually rely on the afflictions by the force of having done this many times. We've been doing this since beginningless time. There's no way of even counting the number of times we've been doing this. Because of this, from now on, we should heap upon ourselves, we who desire our own happiness and pleasure, all the sufferings without exception of all the beings who are similar in kind to us in being driven by actions and habituated to the afflictions. So this is kind of, again, although it's technically not yet in the section dealing with Tonglen, verse 9 is kind of the one that's singled out as pertaining to that. We saw that on the outline when we looked at it earlier. It's introducing this concept of like when we see others suffering, we should have the courage, again, be like that courageous bodhisattva, like that peacock that's willing to eat poison, to kind of go to the place of wanting that suffering to ripen upon ourselves. And then, of course, the other side of Tonglen is the giving exercise, where we give what happiness we have to others. These are the way of practicing compassion, wanting to remove suffering, and the love for other beings that wants to give them happiness. As I said, we're going to see more of that when we get together next week, and that's actually the main practice that we're going to be engaging in with regard to many of these sufferings that we're going to explore in verses 10 through 48. So verse 9, the first two lines says, supposing we were to dwell entangled in selfishness, at that time, to counteract it, we should give our happiness and pleasure to migrating beings. So this is kind of the other side of the Tonglen, of giving, of saying that whenever we're experiencing happiness, rather than getting caught up in our own selfish, ridiculous attitude, we should be thinking about others, wanting to give that to them. So it says here at the bottom, supposing, that is hypothetically, that even though it is in fact impossible for most bodhisattvas to ever dwell entangled in selfishness, whereas we who are not, are still quite entangled in it, if, or supposing that, by the force of previous habituation, it were possible for this to happen to some of them, at that time they should counteract it through reproaching themselves, saying, you are hopeless. Then they should give away however many excellent things they have, such as their happiness, pleasure, and so forth, to migrating sentient beings. So what was being said in that verse was like, we're talking about, again, pretty high level bodhisattvas that have probably already removed a lot of their selfishness, or if not all of it. And so it's not really a big issue for them. But if they were to be in a situation where that could arise, they would think of others and think about giving to them and not engage in this selfish attitude of clinging to things for themselves, which is what ordinary beings do, because that's the factors that we are under the control of. And then to conclude this verse, verse 9, likewise, when those around us mistreat us, we should be filled with contentment, thinking this is retribution for having distracted them. This is kind of, again, the taking side of it when we just use verse 9 as encapsulating taking and giving. The idea here is that one of the main first thoughts that we should have whenever we're experiencing suffering, whether it be beings who are mistreating us or situations in life that we just simply have to encounter that are painful, unpleasant, we think, this is retribution for what I've done in the past. That's the theme that we're going to get into next week when we start with verse 10, again through 48. These are the ones that deal with karma. This is why Venerable Chodron's book is called Good Karma, because it's all about how do we make our karma better than it has been by using what we are experiencing as a doorway to learn, to actually change. So let's go through the commentary on this, and then I'll see I might have a few more other comments before we go to the discussion for tonight. Likewise, when no matter how much we have benefited those around us, from the least of our servants up to our students, they inflict harm upon us in return. That is, they mistreat us by repaying our kindness with unpleasant talk, deprecation, and so forth. Without thinking it is anything else, think that that is retribution for our having distracted them. That is for our self-cherishing, having affected them in a similar way. Accordingly, this is retribution for having previously cherished ourselves and inflicted harm on others. We should be filled with contentment for ourselves and say to ourselves, now you yourself are being benefited, right? Because we can use that as a way of exhausting our karma and changing our minds. This idea, this is very similar again to one of the verses in the 8 verses, right? When someone whom I have benefited and in whom I have great hopes gives me terrible harm, I shall regard that person as my most holy guru. Like if those beings in this particular situation who we've really taken care of turn around and harm us, we should go, they're my guru. This is my opportunity to learn. I need to learn how my self-cherishing mind, my selfishness is arising and seeing that I don't want this to happen. And they feel like I should, retaliate against them because I've been only kind to them and they are now harming me in response to my benefit. That's a hard one, right? But again, this is just pointing us in the direction of this idea of using suffering, using something we're experiencing as a doorway to be able to transmute it, to use it as opening our hearts to the suffering of others, to think about them and so on. Again, we'll go into this a little bit more at the beginning of next week, because as I said, the kind of refrain that we get with these verses coming forward from 10 through 48 are about how we have to then see it as an opportunity to practice Tonglen in everything we meet. So tonight, again, these initial verses, they're kind of a little bit all over the place in some way. They start off with the peacocks and that analogy, and then they go on to talk about, the crows, and then a bit more about transforming desire into the path and all these things that are maybe, again, not the main topic of what we're talking about in this text. But it's kind of sets the stage when we get to the end in particular about what we're going to be looking at. the transmutation of whatever we're experiencing, primarily suffering, because that's the tough stuff, right? That's the harder stuff. Well, we can still work on transmuting the happiness as well, the pleasure, but transforming what we're experiencing that's painful and difficult into a path of learning and developing our hearts and our minds and cherishing others at those times rather than getting all, selfish and involved in our own stuff. That's what we really have to kind of work on. Let me just make sure there was nothing else I wanted to present in regard to the slides. Verse 9. Again, that was that separate verse. What was on the screen there was just the outline. Practicing removing other suffering and giving them happiness. Again, that's usually identified as the Tonglen verse, but the verse 8, the second part of it, almost seemed to be a little closer to Tonglen. But okay, so next week we'll start with that, introducing what happens in those verses. And that will be something that'll go on for a couple of weeks. We'll be working with that. It's a really interesting part of the text because, again, it gives us different scenarios. If this is what's happening to you, guess what? It's your karma coming home to roost, your wheel of sharp weapons that you threw out that's now coming back to cut you. All right, that's where we get into that second meaning of this wheel of sharp weapons. And then we have to learn from it, not just, be miserable in our suffering. So first, just any quick questions from tonight, if there's like one or two, just to make sure things are clear before we do discussion. Yeah, Ruth, please.
On the homework assignment, number 3 says briefly comment on verse 8. Does that mean verse 9 or does that mean verse 8?
It actually means verse 8.
Okay.
Yeah. Even though 9 was the Tonglen verse, I'm going to ask more about Tonglen in relation to, I think, verse 10, when I teach a little more on Tonglen as part of that next week.
Yeah, because you were changing the numbers at the start, so I was like, well, I didn't know.
Yeah. No, it means 8 according to our text. And again, I'm sorry that the thing is kind of messed up with regard to these different verse numbers that outline. Again, that's the verse that is the last one of the first section. Bodhisattvas transform afflictions and self-grasping into the path.
I did have one other comment. In my mind, I would reverse peacocks and crows. I mean, I don't know if they saw, I understand the explanation, but, just from, what we see in the Western world with crows and peacocks, I would have put the peacocks in with the, self-absorbed, self-cherishing, arrogant, type of thing. And the crows are.
Yeah, they say crows and ravens are actually very intelligent birds.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I can't imagine them eating poison, but I don't know.
Anyway.
They eat a lot of carrion, that's for sure. So you do see them kind of eating things that most other beings might not want to eat, but I don't know. I mean, again, there's some mythology around some of these creatures, I guess, and I don't know why they chose crows in particular. Again, the whole history of this text is a little mysterious, as you can see if you go to any of these books where there's a write-up on kind of what all transpired to bring this text into the forefront. And even in Tibet, it wasn't one that was studied for many, many centuries. I think it was like in the 1700s or something like that, 1800s, when one particular teacher thought it was a good text to begin teaching again, and then it kind of resurfaced. And so it's kind of come to the forefront of being one of the more prominent mind training texts, but it really wasn't for quite a few centuries after it was introduced into Tibet by Lama Atisha. So whether it really was or not, I mean, again, there's some suspicion around whether this was perhaps composed by somebody in Tibet and not in India, because they actually said things like aconite, which is part of this mythology of the peacock. It's only located in some Himalayan regions or something. You wouldn't find it where peacocks are normally wandering around India.
Right. Yeah. Well, and there's something like 40 different species of crows. So, maybe they are different. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they have, they act differently in different parts of the world. I don't know.
It's possible. I don't know. None of the teachers seem to address any issues about the crows.
All right. Thanks.
Anything else before we do our discussion? Again, so maybe we just take like a minute or two. People want to just get up and stretch. If you need to use the restroom or something, I'll leave that in kind of Bill's hands to coordinate when everybody comes back and get everybody into discussion. mode. Remember, there was one question from last week that we didn't discuss because I covered it at the beginning of tonight. So you can certainly do that one, which was back here, that one. Question 3 about the title. And then there is the 3 questions from tonight that again included the one that Ruth was asking about, verse 8. I didn't put the actual verses here, but you all have copies of the verses, so you can use those when you're going through that. And did you want to say something, Bill?
Yeah, I was wondering if we should keep recording the discussion or stop recording the discussion.
I don't know. I mean, it might be helpful for people to listen to, and especially if you don't attend, if you needed to catch up just to hear what people discussed in regard to it. So maybe we leave it in there. If people are okay with it, I mean, it does mean that you are being recorded for posterity. So, okay. All right. So again, let's just do like 1 or 2 minutes, just get up and stretch. And then I'm going to be listening in like I did last week for tonight. And then I'll come in and we'll do the dedication prayers and that at the end. Okay. All right.
All right, folks. Well, I'm back. Give everybody another minute or something. So, well, first, I guess going back to last week, the wheel of sharp weapons that strikes at the enemy's vital point. Does anybody have any comments on the full title of the text? Don't know what the vital point is. I hope. Hope we've at least remembered that. Yes, Marilyn.
Well, I think that it's just hitting the vital points of self-cherishing and self-grasping, right?
Yes. The self-cherishing mind. I think that's good. I think we should. I mean, does anybody have any questions about the title of the text? Anything? I think we can move to the first two verses. So my little discussion prompt for this, Ruth kind of already started it in a way, but is this a good analogy? Really, I think that's what the first two verses do, is kind of set up this analogy in the text. And yeah, I'm trying to think about it from a debate standpoint, I guess. So what do you think of the analogy? I guess we got Ruth's take on it. She thought maybe they got it backwards. Was also thinking, are there other analogies that might also work?
I think the analogy of like thriving on poison works, but maybe not the specific choice of birds. Reading too much into it, probably.
Yeah. I was thinking of like extremophile bacteria.
I think this is something that I struggle with sometimes, I mean, here we have something that was written, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And their perception or their experience is different than ours. And so, sometimes I get caught up in the little details like that, the crow and the peacock thing, but yeah, I might rewrite it if it was up to me, but
Looks like we may have lost Bill.
Hey, this is Danae here. So I like the peacock aspect, it's kind of like the part where they're
Did we lose you, Danae?
Yeah, I'm having issues too, so I'm going to keep my video off. It looks like Danae's muted, so maybe she somehow got muted.
yeah, my connection's really spotty, so
Yeah, mine isn't good tonight either.
yeah. But yeah, I guess since I'm here, I'll just say my point, which is it's like alchemy. It's like the peacock has this natural quality to transform these things. And that's so rare, like the bodhisattvas are rare to have this transformative quality. So I like that aspect. That's what I see.
So maybe we can move on to the second question, which is discuss verse 4. And I was thinking during this about the first thing I was thinking about is just that aspect of not even noticing desire when it arises. So I thought I would put that out for discussion. When do you notice desire? And one thing I was thinking about is how many times desire arose in my mind during the teaching about other things. And then I thought about whether those things would bring me any happiness, actually. Anyway. And then the second part of the discussion question that I came up with is what desires could you potentially use to benefit sentient beings?
So, I'm still struggling with
I think we need to just use one of your things there, Nanda, or mute one of them. Like your speaker, not the microphone. I'm not sure what's going on.
I'm gonna turn it all off.
Nanda, one thing you could do is if you want to type.
It's okay.
I know what's wrong, but I can't fix it from where I am.
You know,
Sorry.
appreciate the thought.
One of your speakers is feeding back into your microphone. So if you turn down the volume on your devices or on one of them, it should stop that. No, wrong one, I think. Anyway, anybody else while we're ironing that out? Anybody else? I'm doing my best to not talk.
Okay, I'll jump in. I mean, for me, desire is so pervasive and so subtle in many cases that I feel like it's arising all the time in every decision that I make. So I don't know that. I mean, I often don't recognize it, right? Because it's just takes like a preference or something like that. But you know, focusing on the desires to help ease the suffering of others. You asked about ways to use desire for positive effects. I think I'm not sure exactly if that's how you said it, but you know, yeah. And one of the intentions that I got from Pema Children was like, you know, being able to hear the cries of others without wanting to run away. You know, so just that desire to be able to be present and be with people when they're suffering and struggling as well, which is where I spend a lot of my time. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
One thing I was thinking about is, I know it's attachment to reputation, but like my desire to like want to be seen as like a good student or like a good practitioner. It's attachment to reputation, but it does fuel like my motivation to continue to practice and to show up to teachings and to make sure I'm concentrating and writing things down and doing all those things. So it is benefiting me, even though I know it's feeding my attachment.
Anyone else? Yeah, Ruth.
Yeah, I really agree with Melanie. I think desire is ubiquitous. It's always there. It's just now I'm becoming aware of it. I mean, your desire to be comfortable, to be warm, to be cold, to eat, to go to bed, to, I don't know. It's just every little decision that you make. And and sometimes I think that desire is also kind of intertwined with being of benefit. When you invite somebody over for dinner, or that needs some company, or whether you pick up the phone to talk with them because they're lonely, or help them with this or that, or like I have a dog with cancer, and I want to make her comfortable, and I want to do the best I can for her. But it's kind of mixed up with my desire that I want her to stay around, right? And she's my companion, so I don't know. The deeper you go, the deeper I go into this, the more complicated it seems to sort it all out.
So,
So,
Go ahead.
Ruth, I want to say, I turned off half of it, and this may fail again. Anyway, I lost my train of thought. Wanting to be happy, wanting to be comfortable, wanting to be, the deeper you go into it, the more complicated it gets. That's what I wanted to talk about. The deeper you go into it, the more complicated it gets, yes, but at the same time, it stays just as simple. Like the writings that we're studying were written so long ago by people whose lives we can never know anything about. And we're trying to apply them to a world that they couldn't possibly comprehend. But the essence of the message is really straightforward and simple. And when I get bogged down in the academia part of it, that's what I try to remember. That's all.
And last but not least, verse 8. I'm still a little confused by this one, honestly. I guess I'm confused by the term hedonism in this context. So I don't know if anyone has any insights. Yeah, can somebody want to read verse 8 for us? I don't have it handy. I have it on the screen, but I think it'll be someone else read it.
The sufferings of all beings who are similar in kind to us, in parentheses, in being driven by actions and habituated to the afflictions, should be heaped upon us hedonists. Hedonists being we who desire pleasure.
Radio silence.
Well, so I guess the only thing I would say is the same thing I said before, which is that whenever you try to take writings from a time so far distant, like just the simple term hedonist, right? So we have that brings to mind in our culture at our time what a hedonist is. But there's no way to know what at the time that this writing was done, if the definition of hedonist at that time matches, like we assume it matches. We think, oh, they're probably saying the same thing. A hedonist of that time is the same as a hedonist of this time. But we don't actually know that, right? So there's this I think for myself, the other thing that I have to mention is that I have a different translation. I found this on the web somewhere. Have this is a different translation from a different person, and the commentary is from a different person. And honestly, so far, I have to say, this one's a little more straightforward, a little less ambiguous in its language to me. And I don't know really why I'm even bringing that up, but it's like how to take something from thousands of years ago and apply it to my current life existence, and how to translate so many translations of time and space and language, and how to actually, what do I take and what do I leave alone? What do I incorporate?
I think I'm gonna come in at this point. We're getting close to 8:30 anyway, so.
Yeah.
But thank you, Nanda. Yeah, I mean, actually, this is the one book that you were holding. I think this is a translation that was done by like 3 people, Jonathan Landau and Alex Berzin, and maybe 5 people actually. Even Geshe Noah Darge was involved in it. It's also not a literal line by line translation. It's filled out with a teaching in a sense too. So for like that verse 8, it was like 6 lines in here versus the 3 lines that we had, and so it was meant to be kind of a little more of a commentary on the verse, just not the straight language. But this is an issue for a lot of things. I agree with you that for whatever reason, the translator of our version chose hedonists, whereas I think Thupten Jinpa simply said, those of us who yearn for pleasure, that kind of thing. It just didn't really kind of peg it as a hedonist. Yeah, the self that yearns for happiness. So we do end up with different translation choices for the Tibetan words that can compound it in some ways or confound it, maybe in our own minds in terms of what's really being said. But I agree with you, it's very hard when you look at something that's 1,000 years old and say, what were they really meaning by this? But nonetheless, that's where it is helpful sometimes to have a couple of different translations to compare it to. But I think in Peacock and the Poison Grove, that one, I think they do use a different translation that was done specifically for it. This is the older version of that. It's got a new cover now, but anyway, that one I think is a little different. And then Thupten Jinpa's again is used by Venerable Chodron, and they all have their pluses and minuses. You just have to kind of work with them, and I'll try to sort that through as we go through. But I do want to mention a few things on people were talking about like how you can have kind of mixed minds that have some level of compassion or love, but there's also some attachment, some desire going on. This is quite natural, I think, for us to have, and we shouldn't beat ourselves up too much about that reality. That, you know, it is very easy for us to have attachment creeping when, like, even what Colleen said when we're studying the Dharma, for suddenly, you know, some things to kind of get in the way. Just to be aware of it as much as you can. And the watching for desire is really hard, because I agree with you. It's there pretty much as a constant. Yes, that where it becomes more complicated is when we are trying to kind of grasp at things in a way that isn't recognizing their impermanence. You know, if we're experiencing something and we just kind of, you know, our mind goes to, oh, I need this, or I want that. You know, we can still bring some wisdom to it and just recognize that, yeah, we have a desire that craves various things in our lives, but we do see that that's not the answer, that we're not really looking for some kind of permanent solution through those things. Then I think it becomes a little less powerful in terms of controlling our minds versus those things that we really get attached to that just continually come up for us, that can become problematic. So, but that's why going back to the 8 worldly dharmas that were mentioned, they're all forms of attachment that we can have to kind of deal with. Our attachment to pleasure and our aversion to being uncomfortable. And it's just part of our lives. So, and we can work with it over time. The only other thing I mentioned, Bill, when you were going through that initial question that was from last week, there's also kind of just the idea of the enemy. When we say enemy's vital point, well, but what is the enemy? Again, just that emphasis on the inner enemy versus the outer enemies, and not wanting to, you know, in any way confuse those, that the outer enemy is not the real enemy. The real enemy is within. So, but any questions to conclude from tonight? So what I would encourage you to do, we talked about kind of watching the minds of self-cherishing and self-grasping. Maybe we can start with a kind of a coarser mind, which is the mind of attachment, which again is also still quite pervasive, but maybe see where it comes up more frequently for you and kind of how that can become problematic, particularly if it leads you into places where you don't get what you want, and where attachment has that experience of being thwarted in getting the things that we desire. And then the mind that comes up then, which is that mind of aversion or anger, that can very easily arise based on the strength of our attachment. So I'm just encouraging you to do that, because again, this is part of our practice, even though again, that main emphasis of this text is to work with difficult situations, suffering situations. Oftentimes those are coming because we have an attachment or an expectation that things are going to be the opposite. Right? We get very much about, we want things to be a particular way. And that's what attachment is all about. And so if we see the strength of that, especially again at those times when it is quite powerful, then maybe we can begin to lessen it to some degree, so that when things go south, there's at least the space for us to be able to start to work with it and see it as a situation to learn, as opposed to be reacting in a more habitual ways of getting angry and upset. Because as Venerable Urbina says, you know, that is what happens when attachment doesn't get what it wants. Well, then that's what happens with anger, aversion, that energy. Because we're going to be moving again into the section where we're looking at when the crap happens, when the horrible things happen, how do we react to that, or respond might be a better way to put it, you know, so that we actually have a healthy response rather than a habitual reaction. So, okay, then let's conclude tonight. Thank you, Bill, for leading the discussion group again tonight. And let's put on the screen the prayers. Let's get those up here. Okay, over here. So let's begin with the dedication prayers. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then for His Holiness, the wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then by virtue of that, may all of our gurus who are still with us now have good health and long lives so we can continue to have them in this world. And then for Rinpoche to return swiftly, let's recite these verses. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wear the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels, and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. And let's dedicate to conclude to all those beings who we're holding in our hearts right now. We all have beings who we know who are experiencing various types of suffering, difficulty. We make strong prayers for their benefit, that they can be free from their suffering and find all the causes that will lead to true peace and happiness through what we have done here tonight. And may this be so for all beings by virtue of our merits. Okay, so again, we got some practice advice. You can look over these questions, look over the commentary that you have from Geshe-la, as well as any of the other texts that you're reading. Again, you might see slight changes or variations on what I might have said versus what's in some of these other commentaries, but they're not huge differences. Usually there's just finer points that are being made or what have you, but it is good to have another text to read because it's hard for me to, in like an hour and a half even, to comment really extensively on all of these verses. We'd be here till like middle of next year if that were the case. So anyway, all right, everyone, have a good week. I'll see you next Tuesday. Be well.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you all. Thank you, Colleen, for hosting. And again, Bill's not with us anymore. Is he? Oh, there he is. Yeah. His ship is there. It hasn't sailed yet. Okay.
Thank you, Don.
All right, everyone. Be well. See you. Bye-bye.